All right, I would like to introduce Ben Sawyer, who I view as the elder statesman of serious games. He's been running the Serious Games Conference since 2002. He also runs Games for Health and has a radar that includes everyone who's basically doing anything anywhere in the world about games that's not purely for entertainment purposes. So without further ado, Ben.
Okay, that's the first time I've ever been called an elder statesman. I guess that really means my 40th birthday is next month. I don't know how this works, so I'm going to bear with me as where can I see my slides? They're not here. Is there overhead? Okay, so I have to look this way? Okay, that's okay. Enjoy this better side. Okay, so I'm just here to kind of try and level set a little bit. So what I've got is a little bit of why we're making the case for serious games, a little bit of sort of my perceptive thought patterns as to how it might apply to this world, and then a little bit about how we can do this and what kind of works. And it's fairly high level, but hopefully it kind of frames further discussions, especially tomorrow for the unconference side of things, which I'm looking forward to. So games and diplomacy have gone together for quite some time. The game diplomacy exists. Many people in this audience probably played it at some point. And then, of course, Genghis Khan in Civ 4 or 5, and you have to do some basic diplomacy with these characters. I will make the point, though, that as interesting as civilization tries to be about these things, everything basically devolves to war. So it's not far off, right? All games are serious. We're going to talk about what we collectively call the serious game space, but playing games is something that I take very seriously. Entertainment is a serious pursuit of mankind, and people who are alive in the world and entertaining and having fun with their friends and their family members and others, this is nothing to sneeze at, but the point is it's been so powerful in that medium or that particular sector, we should be really thinking about how we can widen the utility of games and game technologies. I always tell you what I've been playing lately. I think it's important that people who talk in this space show you this slide. Even if it just shows you Pac-Man, you know where they're coming from, you have a sense of what's going on, and on top of that, maybe you learn a few games that are worth playing. So there's some Facebook games, some iPad games, Lego Star Wars, which I'm playing with my son, and of course Red Dead Redemption, sort of your AAA title. Of course, this is really all I'm doing. I'm playing Minecraft as much as possible, and this is a building that took me about a couple of months to build with my son. Anybody who plays Minecraft, that's brick, and it was not just cheated to build. So you can understand the time. This is the Games for Health conference, which we just finished last week, which is why I'm still tired. But this was 3 days, over 125 speakers, over 80 sessions. Really incredible stuff. Keynotes from Google and from Dr. Martin Seligman of the Positive Psychology Center at UPenn, who I'll talk about in a bit. And I invite you all to come next year. So what are serious games? Well, it starts with the fact that there's these two sort of underlying rules in technology, Moore's law and Metcalfe's law, and these basically describe the sort of exponential gain of technology. So how many transistors we can put on a chip every 2 years and the cost structure of that, as well as the exponential gain for every new person who joins a network. So what happens here is we start with very basic games, and Moore's law and Metcalfe's law take over, and we get something Red Dead Redemption, which is a media extravaganza. And while not every game is a AAA title, what's going on is you see something that amazing, and it's come that far, and you can look at some of these alternative game design patterns, things that are not like super high-res graphics, but have very interesting, powerful capabilities on their own, from everything from alternate reality games to things like Yville and Habbo Hotel, which have millions of players, to simple HTML-based fantasy sports games, which have millions of players in interesting social network settings. And so people respond to this. They're responding to that power curve of interaction, the power curve of media, the power curve of simulation, and the ability to have this emotional sort of response in a very deep way. And these are some great pictures that were done by this photographer that show you the emotional responses. It's not enough to look at what's on the screen. You have to look at what's going, point the camera the other way. And this really, without giving you empirical evidence, gives you some sense of what's going on. I very rarely would ever see someone do that at a movie as much anymore. This looks more like an amusement ride in that sense. So what you get is this possibility gap. If you look at what most e-learning and productivity applications require today, the sort of baseline set of systems that power most enterprises, be they NGOs, government, or enterprises, you sort of top out around on the Moore's Law and Metcalfe Law power curve somewhere around 2002. But what is sort of the largest application structure that, outside of like some high performance computing needs, that has really pushed the edge of desktop based power? And that's been video games. So the reason why we have serious games in the biggest sense, in the modern context, is that leadership of all levels inside organizations, big and small, are realizing that there's something more powerful in what they see on these consoles, on these iPads, on these mobile phones, and in their living rooms than what they're getting at their desktops at work. And they're saying that they didn't get to the top or near the top in these leadership organizations not knowing arbitrage, not knowing how to exploit a potential situation. And that doesn't mean that we're doing it perfectly, but it's really clear that there's some differential there that we're trying to take advantage of. So serious games is the use of video games and game technologies for purposes beyond entertainment. That's the simplest explanation I've been able to develop. But what I could talk about is, let's take this apart a little bit more. And so I wrote this sentence. This is sort of a thought process that I've had where I'm trying to match up some ideas around the theory of all this as I learn it and explore it myself, relevant to what games are. So forget for a fact about games, the sort of core definition of games being challenges and goals and all these things. But let's think about them in terms of what we're actually asking from them in this context. So they're accessible interfaces. They're very easy to pick up and play with. And they're interactive and they're iterative. So we play these things over and over again often. And they're representational frameworks. So they're not necessarily meant to be perfect frameworks. They're not, even though games use a lot of simulation, it does not mean that the goal of a game is the pursuit of fidelity, the way a particular simulation lab might pursue it. It's more about the user experience and those representational frameworks that you can get that ultimately try to motivate sort of mastery. And we could sort of look at this and start lining up various ideas in terms of learning theory, behavior change that we think about. So what about, does all of this lead, and this is the big question that I've had since starting in this in 2002, and before that doing a serious game all the way back to 1999, is this notion of, do we get comparative advantage? So a lot of the times, one of the things that I'm kind of curious about when somebody's talking to me about a particular problem that they're trying to solve is I sort of first ask myself, has this been like an intractable problem? Like it's sort of, if you're talking to me, why didn't anything else work before? What particular advantage are you trying to do? And always trying to kind of ask myself over and over again, what are the kinds of advantages and how do we find those advantages? So we started working on this a little bit. This is some recent work where we're trying to look at 4 sort of different areas that maybe this kind of comes together under. And we could sort of look at these by lining up some different ideas about cognition, linguistics, psychology, and technology. You see the sort of networks going back to Metcalfe's law, computational media, sort of drawing from Moore's law a little bit. But again, not just this notion of pedagogy, not just this notion of learning, but also the notion of behavior change, which tells you a lot about what's going on in games for health. So we could sort of translate these a little bit more into sort of the computer and sort of video game realm, and we think about them in terms of interface, the sort of transfer mechanisms that we're looking for, the overall utility. And often in the serious game space, what we forget about is that sometimes what we're trying to transfer is the core utility of games, the ability to push them out to millions of people, to use very low-cost networks But to take an existing pedagogy or system that's worked, such as live-action role-playing, and move it into a computerized environment so that we could take advantage of some core utilities that were afforded by computer systems and networks. And then, of course, systems, the ability to model, visualize, and simulate some of these worlds at varying levels of fidelity. But, of course, really what goes on is the combination of this. And this is what kind of makes it hard. It's the combination of all these different things. If you really want to find great serious games research, you sort of have to look for it everywhere. I have reams of it, but it's from every different journal you can possibly imagine. So it's not all housed in one place. It draws on so many different things, and this is what's made part of it makes it so difficult, because it is really so interdisciplinary. So what's special about games, though? So for me, the number one special thing about games is gameplay, the notion of playing these things. And it's really the process of gameplay is perfected by really good designers and development teams and circumstances. And then we have these specific attributes. I sort of called some of them out, but I sort of call it like the micropsychology of games. And this is where you start to match up different ideas like score and graphics and story and rewards. And some of this you're starting to see play out in the gamification movement. What gamification in my mind is they're trying to extract some bits and pieces of that micropsychology, apply them outside of a more well-formed game experience, and seeing if that plus productivity style applications can kind of mash up and be something better than it was in terms of the productivity side beforehand. The difficulty is whether or not they're bringing enough to the whole equation, or if they're just trying to take a part of the equation and promise you everything. But there's definitely bits and pieces of that have been working. Then it's this optimization. And I think, when we heard about A/B testing and other things, testing is so important in the optimization of the user's experience, how they perceive what it is you're putting forward, is what's so paramount to this. And in doing that, game developers often purposefully abstract the underlying content. So that they can basically pull almost like an editor. It's the what, why, where, when. It's not every last detail. It's enough so that the person can put themselves in that frame of mind. And this is why sometimes we look at games and we kind of wonder if they're really the perfect solution. Not every game is meant to be Flight Simulator. At the same time, the question becomes, can we combine these things? Can we take what's great about a game, combine it with a professor or a teacher or a trainer or some other surrounding context where we fill in these blanks? But so we're pouring this additional information into that framework that's been established by the game. So to me, what really becomes special is this combination of the process of creating games and the process of playing them, and the feedback cycles that go on in between, and optimizing those different pieces together. That's what happens in commercial games. Really great commercial games were brilliantly created and conceived, but they were conceived out of the constant cauldron of feedback that comes from the game-playing community. So does any of this work? So we could look at some studies. Obviously, these are very power-packed slides, and I can make them available afterwards. But again, some studies, this one of management courses, one using a game, one not using a game. And in this case, they weren't teaching with the game. They were making the game available as an adjunct to the class that allowed the students to go in and do additional work. And they got higher test results. I was happy that they actually used one of my games. Remission is a behavior change game aimed at pediatric cancer patients. It embeds information about cancer and fighting cancer within the game, both with cutscenes that sort of explain things, but also in the game's procedural rhetoric, as Ian Bogos would use. The actual rules of the game dictate that you have to fight cancer to the very last cell or it's going to come back. And so that is embedded within the game. And of course, they got some great results out of this. They are continuing to improve it. They're working on, I think, a new version. But what they found was significant. West Virginia did some work with Dance Dance Revolution, rolling it out as a particular exercise regimen. What's important in this context, besides the fact that they found that there was efficacy here, was that, and it's not on this slide completely, is that they found a very particular segment of people responded to the idea of DDR as an alternative PE solution. It wasn't, the kids who were responding to this, especially young tween-age males, had shunned other opportunities for alternative forms of physical ed. And then it also then became a stepping stone to getting back into things like biking and running and doing other, what we would consider normalized senses of activity. Hope Lab, which made remission, did some subsequent studies of people in exercising kids and asking them, and found a similar psychographic profile in their work. And what this says is that there's opportunities to reach certain audiences with games that we weren't reaching before. In the case of electromagnetism supercharge, an MIT-based project, what was interesting was not only did they find a little bit of difference pre-test, post-test with both boys and girl groups in terms of this physics education, but they found that the female players actually had a larger gain as a cohort. Not absolutely, but relatively to their previous scores. And there was some sense that the exploration sort of style of the game may have contributed to that. But the other thing is that what they called out in their research, they did some depth interviews. You can see below, I love this interviewer who asks the game player, and the game player has this very rich definition of what's going on and really can explain it through their gameplay. And then they ask another person who had scored fine, how did you know that? And why do you think it looks like that? Because I don't know, the teacher said so. And I just regurgitated it properly for you. So what this slide should talk to you about a little bit is not just whether or not these games can work, but the way you find out if they're working or exactly what's actually underlying it may require a little bit more of an in-depth interview process and really looking at how people are thinking, not just whether or not they're getting the answers right. WolfQuest was another project recently assessed, and they found this was a sort of public project to raise to spread science in a more informal context, not necessarily in a classroom. And again, they found some nice self-reported knowledge gains. And this was an NSF-funded project, and I believe they're pretty happy with the results. We can also look at biology. So Hope Lab took remission and presented it both in interactive form and passive exposure, meaning the person got to see the game played but didn't actually play it. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I actually have some sense that more is going on in the interactive play slide or picture than in the other, and specifically some of the sections that are being illuminated a little bit more with blood flow in the interactive play deal with things like motor control, memory, and some emotional areas. This is very early, but you're going to see a lot more of this. And in the Games for Health space, we're seeing tons and tons of work to biometrically measure what's going on as a result of the game, moving past sort of the pre- and post-test and depth interview styles that you see in more learning contexts. And I think this is going to be a very robust field, both moving into learning as well. There's some great researchers both at LIU and not only at Stanford where these were done, but at University of California, San Francisco that are doing some research work with Robert Wood Johnson Health Games research money to look at this process and really kind of get a better understanding of what's going on. Of course, you can also look at studies that tell us maybe it isn't going to work all the time. This was a project I'm very proud that they put out their information where they failed. But essentially, one of the things that they did here was they told the kids, tomorrow in math class you'll get to play a game. And then they brought in this very Windows application looking sort of confusing 3D thing that they thought they were building a game. And they really got some very disappointing negative comments from kids. They also found a lot of problems with the computer lab and the unproductive setting. They hadn't really thought about exactly where and how it was going to be played. And as somebody said, one game was really just awful and in fact reported it was worse than math class. And this really speaks to the fact that remember Red Dead Redemption, remember Minecraft, remember all those games I showed you I'm playing lately. There is a perceptive definition of video games to people when you tell them they're going to get a game, especially to people who play video games. And it's not that you have to build Red Dead Redemption to get a result, but you do have to bring some level of craftsmanship to the level of whatever you're building, be it even a simple SMS game, to a Facebook game, to something even bigger than that. It really needs to be polished. You really need to think it through, and you can't just promise someone something in absence and expect them to show up and not bring a little level of cognitive dissonance to the table, which can be shattering to your heartfelt plans. Commercial games, we hold these up, right? This is why we're here. This is why they're so incredible. This stuff is amazing, and they're so brilliant, and we should learn everything from them. And if we just turned over all of our ideas to them, they would brilliantly produce things that blew us away. The fact is, they don't do this in their own business every day. Yes, we make incredible games in the games industry, and we make a lot of failures. It's hard. It's hard there. It's harder in serious games. But don't just think that it's this magic bullet in that sense either. And so you can see their own results. So simple. Games can work, and projects can fail. We should move past the idea that whether or not games can potentially help, whether or not you need ultimate proof. You're most likely not going to get the proof that is perfectly to what your situation is. We're not in the business of doing 10,000 studies before we build 10,000 games to prove that your particular need is going to work. But we can see that good serious game projects have had some level of success, and we know good commercial games have had some level of success. And it's our job to unpack those and figure out how to bring that success over to us and hopefully not have our projects fail. What about how we can use them? So this is a serious games taxonomy that myself and Peter Smith at University of Central Florida, who's now at the ADL CoLab, did, where we took the sort of different sectors of the economy down the left-hand side, and then across the top, the very big areas where games were being used: health, advertising, training, education. We've even seen them in science and research, production, and even just as forms of work themselves. And what we tried to do here was, let's see, it's a very small pointer. We tried to sort of show you, like, games for education, and then education as a practice gives you sort of learning games. And what we were trying to do is, learning might appear a few other places, but as you move away from this, you get into some very different ideas, like visualization and epidemiology. We're a long way from learning, folks. Unless you want to devolve everything to that, that's fine. But often, the serious game space, depending on who you hear from, you would walk out saying, this is games for learning, this is games for training. But it's so many different things. And, at first you think this is conjecture, but, this slide's like 3 years old. Someday I'll update it. But these are examples of games in each one of those boxes. So even 3 years ago, whether it was a prototype, a shipping game, a piece of research, there were people specifically working towards each of those boxes. And in fact, I think we can get up to about 80% now, and certainly multiple examples in each one. We've even built these taxonomies out at lower levels. This is the one that we use right now for health and healthcare, and we're actually going to revise this with some information from our latest conference. But again, what you see going on here is a lot of different ideas. And at first you would say, well, wait a minute, informatics, public health, this idea of epidemiology, but there's been 3 or 4 really interesting either papers or projects that speak to how researchers in computational epidemiology have been using video games and instances of viral outbreaks in video games to update and enhance their own modeling and research in the area. Very, very cool. We can look at advertising, which in terms of thinking about things like public diplomacy, public affairs. What's important here is that while we have standalone advert games, we have things like in-game placement, out-of-game placement, banner ads, interstitials, and then we even have games that are inside ads. So Volvo ran a bunch of ads using footage of a Volvo car inside a video game, and then just took that footage and said, aren't we cool? Put it up on television. Coca-Cola, you don't get any better than that in terms of, well, maybe not in other things, but in terms of advertising, you don't get any better than that. And they decided they were going to be buddy-buddy with World of Warcraft in China. So when Coca-Cola decides it needs to stand next to a video game in order to affect its worldwide marketing, I think that should raise them. Basically make you wake up to the opportunity that what's going on in an even bigger way is this ascendancy of global game culture. and the association of people next to games, not even as games, is becoming a bigger and bigger deal. You can even reuse hardware. So you've got up here, this is Wii controllers reshaped into a laparoscopic surgery trainer. This is some 3D modeling done inside with the Kinect cameras. There's lots of interesting hacks going on with Microsoft's Kinect and Sony's Move. And then, of course, we have Xbox controllers in wired form because you don't want to hack them, being used by the military. Okay, so some random thoughts, right? Like sort of give you a real, nosedive into the sort of serious games framework. But I wanted to think a little bit about how they would be used maybe in your context. And since I don't necessarily work every day in diplomacy and world economic global development, take this for what it is. So the first thing is just thinking about frameworks. I'm very interested over the next day or so to build out some ideas of what kinds of frameworks. So sort of similar taxonomies that you saw me show before. So I'm thinking like, okay, we have, we have to go back. We have diplomacy, and then we think about maybe sort of official or professional channels, but then this notion of public diplomacy. I don't know if Doug Thomas made it, but they've been doing some really interesting work on looking at how massively multiplayer worlds are new forms of public diplomacy inside video games, and very interesting. So we can also look at this idea that we can inform populations, but we can also potentially train them and educate them. And we can educate and develop them along maybe these big sort of 5 big areas. And again, this is just open for conversation. But some other frameworks we could look at, of course, in Millennium Developmental Goals. There's actually, I don't know if they're here, but USC, I've been working a little bit with them on this idea of a game for the 1,000 Days campaign for global health, as well as there's the Alive to 5. We just had Martin Seligman at our conference. I don't know how many people know who he is, but he's the father of positive psychology. And he's been really looking at this idea that we can build health assets within people. We can actually make them more resilient. We can make them happier through a variety of basic understandings and tools that we can apply to them. And he's very interested in looking at using games to take some of their positive psychology training, which they're just doing person to person right now, and turn them into a worldwide affair. Jane McGonigal, who is well known for her ARG work and some of her efforts like Urgent Evoke and World Without Oil, is a big fan of Dr. Seligman's work and is applying it to some of her ideas. Of course, we could look at things like microloans, whether those work. There's frameworks there potentially. But Martin Seligman talks about the idea that if we could take all of his ideas and we could push these out on a global scale, his goal is to see 51% of people testing out at the flourishing end of his psychology scales by 2051. Very global sort of thinking in that regard. And of course, we can look at these as potential frameworks to give us sense of, should have been something else, but targets is what I was getting at. Let's look a little bit about games and learning behavior, though. It's enough to think of games as learning cauldrons, but they're also behavioral cauldrons. And what's interesting to me is that what we really need to start thinking about is how we combine these two things, because just to teach someone does not necessarily change their behavior. Some people it will, a lot of people it won't. And so we have to think about how we combine theories of behavior change with learning and behavior theories. Just as an example, they gave a bunch of kids in the UK brain age. They didn't give it to them because they wanted to improve their neuroplasticity, and that's open to debate with some of these games. It was because there was a very simple math game embedded in it. This is a portable device, and they basically tested it against another sort of math package called Brain Gym, and then controls, and you can see that the Nintendo group scored slightly higher. There's been some other examples of this. In Chile, they did a study with the original Game Boy with some math and reading games. We did a project for Cisco where we did some similar testing. And what was interesting was we basically got what I call the new age of drill and skill. So you think of drill and skill as a very low-level pedagogy, practice a lot. This is kind of where we're trying to move away from with games. We're trying to build richer environments. But think about it as behavior change. The reason these scores were probably going up was they were iterating through more problems. It was a portable device they could carry with them all the time. They were basically doing their homework more. We weren't necessarily teaching them better, we were getting them to practice more. And in certain types of learning, practice is an important asset of it. So to me, this really speaks to just an opening salvo about how we might combine some of the knowledge around behavior change ideas and learning through games. This was the slide you were supposed to see before that, which was back to the frameworks. It's the sense we really need good targets in serious games. I see a lot of interesting stuff in this sort of games for good, games for change area, but a lot of it's self-motivated, and often, and we see this in health too, this is the problem where the building that was endowed to do research in cancer was endowed by somebody whose mom died of cancer. In fact, if you talk to cancer researchers, they would actually say we actually need to, or health researchers, they'd say we need to move some of this money into other areas that don't get a lot of attention because mom didn't die that way. Same thing with this sort of other area. We need better targets from this community. I mean, to me, I might get up tomorrow and think, oh, well, the problems in global health are X because that's what I see on the news or that's what I perceive. But it's not necessarily the best target. And then I start sitting down and writing a game about it. It can end up not really what we want. We can look at platforms as well. When we think in a global context, we have to really rethink platforms. And it was interesting to see that we had sort of social gaming discussion here opening. Obviously, the new most exciting platform for video games right now. But of course, we have laptops, we have smartphones and tablets, but do those really make it out on a global context? Really there, we have more like feature phones, Java, or even just a lot of SMS and sort of WAP-style programming. ZMQ Software has probably one of the largest serious games in terms of an impact level on HIV in India. And it's basically a very simple trivia-style game wrapped in cricket on a feature phone. We could pick at it because it's not like the most amazing game ever built, but it really fit the platform, it fit the country, and they got some results as part of that. So hats off to them. Of course, we see lots of internet cafes, and then we have to think about connectivity. Even if somebody has a rich computing device, how particularly connected are they to the internet? Is it sporadic? Is it intermittent in an internet cafe? So thinking about how those platforms are is really about thinking about who are we really helping and how are we doing that? And often I will sometimes start there on projects like this, just because if I can understand that context better, then I can start worrying about the design a little bit more. So connectivity, though, we could think differently about this. It's not just the internet. We could think about the fact that, well, we might want to build games for lots of people. Maybe the real way to build games is to build better games for the people who go out into the world and do face-to-face training, or who are developmental officers and things like that. We avoid the technology issues. We bring the technology to the person who needs it most, who can then be the one-to-many relationship in the world. We could bridge networks. We've looked at ideas where we use SMS codes between a laptop that's not connected and a game that's giving special SMS-like codes that it can send or receive through the phone. You type them in, sort of like the old way we used to save and load games on Nintendo 8-bit platforms so long ago. What's interesting about that is if we're using the phone to send a simple message that the game told us to send to a server, we're getting even just little bits and pieces of useful connectedness. We know somebody played the game. We know it played it to some sort of standpoint. Maybe now we've captured their number, or we can engage them in a conversation through SMS to create that kind of bridged relationship. And then we also have to think about connectedness in serious games as looping people back to the organizations. The game is not going to be the last thing that they touch, hopefully. If we're doing some sort of game about teaching people how networks work, perhaps now we want to loop them back to Cisco network academies throughout the developing world, where they really can take that initial knowledge and framework into a real organization where we can actually get a deeper level of change. So, to wrap up a little bit, when I think about this audience, I think about this idea of games for everyone, like this notion of globalness. And you have to kind of rethink this a little bit, because really a lot of serious games, including some of the things I talked to you about, they tend to be very narrow. For instance, the cancer game, I made the note last week in my talk at Games for Health. I said, remission is amazing. It did a great job. But is it really a game for everyone? I'm not a 13-year-old or an 8-year-old with cancer, and nor do I want anybody to be. But that's not a health game for everyone. And we've tended to have some sort of one of the ways we pick good targets is sometimes being very narrow to them. And I think it's time that we started thinking a little bit wider at times as well, and thinking about what are games that everyone on the planet should play. And that would be useful if they did. So an example, really simple example, might be a first aid game. If everybody on the planet had some level of good first aid training, this would put someone with that training closer to someone who needs it. And we all know that when somebody needs sometimes first aid help in the difference between life and death, that it really is a time and distance problem. So again, an example of doing something like that that could have a very wide effect, and we could get it into the hands of almost everybody. And we can think about this beyond the health context, but I'm purposely right now thinking about it in health. The other thing that we could think about is that one of the problems in the serious game space is that in order to build games the way we're building computer games today is we tend to close them off. They tend to be simulations of a certain number of factors, certain number of scenarios, certain number of moves or options available to the player. But when I think of diplomacy, when I think of the world that goes on outside of this room, it's not a closed set, right? Things change rapidly. People do things that you never expected. The world's much more complex. And so we need to think about how we might build games away from closed possibility sets, which is how we build them today, and think about the systems that might give us more open possibility sets. So how we bring humans into the loop and create these frameworks where we can have somebody who says, yeah, I'm going to do something you never thought was possible before. I commonly think about this when I was playing Balance of Power a long time ago. A friend of mine and I decided we'd invade Canada from the United States, right? The game's not really prepared for it. It sort of allows you to do it, but it wasn't the same experience as the détente with the Soviet Union, which it was optimized for. So I want the Invade Canada game. And that's not just because I live in Maine and I want to restart the Aroostook War. So we're thinking about some ideas on this within our shop, and we're looking at ways you crowdsource and use social networks and other kinds of expert engines to bring into something that maybe is more open. You don't have to study this slide. I'm just saying this is one particular thought pattern around that. I think there are a lot of others. How do you do this? How do you build serious games? I'm always asked that. Like, what's the best way to do it? And I see lots of research where they're trying to finely tune what particular design to use or how you particularly make a cutscene work or do anything in a game. A lot of research is around these like sort of small design areas. This is how I do it. 5 T's. Really simple. Good target, line up theory behind it, pull in those subject matter experts and really understand how it actually works in the real world. Put together the best team and talent you can possibly find across all your disciplines. And then give them as much time as possible. And then test a lot. So what I'm telling you is that there is no magic formula. There is potentially a formulaic process that you can ascribe to. And you get into this notion of lots and lots of time on pre-production. Really decide what it is you're going to build and how it's going to be done. And stay on paper as long as you possibly can. This is a failure state of many serious games. Focus on your production with really talented individuals. And then think about how you connect your project back to everybody else. It's not enough to just put your game out there. It really is a product within a larger project. And connecting people back to the systems that will take them forward once the game gets them to that point is something that we're still quite failing at. So in summary, games can work. It's not easy. We need strong targets and we need support for those targets. And we need bigger targets, I think. This is my new sort of feeling. Figuring out what your model is going to be is something that you're going to learn about in the next 2 days as you think about this. And really, that recipe for success in serious games is not only understanding why and what kinds of advantages we're trying to draw from them and how other people have done it before, and as much about game development. It really is about figuring out and honing the process by which your organization is going to do these things. The processes will get you. That's the common denominator between good games and bad games is always the process, not something very specific that they did. That always comes out of it. So that's what I came to tell you. Thank you. I don't think I have any more slides.
I think if there are a couple of questions.
I'm around,
from the
so.
audience? Otherwise.
otherwise just, yeah, ask a question, otherwise just tackle him.
I can tackle him, I guess. I was just curious about your idea of invading Canada and targets, because I've had cancer the past year, and was playing a game at the time, an MMO called Warhammer.
Yep. Sure. I haven't played it, but I know it. Yeah.
And the best thing that's ever happened to me is a grassroots movement in Warhammer of pink for tank. Everyone dyed their armor pink. For me, Tinkerbell, and it became a whole breast cancer awareness thing for these young kids. It became much bigger than me for breast cancer in a PvP violent game. That it's amazed me like what that game did for breast cancer awareness among young people. And so I've been trying to figure out, like, how do you do that? Like, it's not meant for that. That wasn't the...
Right. So in our taxonomies, we have a lot of examples of what you're talking about. There have been protests inside games, either against the game itself or in call of other things. There have been these like sort of fundraisers and other types of things. I think in the context of this room, it really falls into this notion of that some of these more socialized games have incredible opportunities in terms of bringing people together in a sort of public diplomacy-like manner and doing things. And they don't have to just happen in a very specialized space. They can actually happen in the games that we use and live in every day. It's all very, very interesting, and I think it speaks to the underlying general notion that all games are serious and that the connections that we make within them are often one of the most powerful things that we get. And so there are examples. I think I could give you more, and you could sort of build a slide stack and start looking at like what are the common denominators and how do they do it. And there's another guy, Joseph DeLapp, who does sort of protest things against war and other things inside some of these multiplayer games. So there are people working on it, actually.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.